I was never supposed to be his father, but that summer in Vegas, Tommy called me Dad for the first time, and I felt something break open inside my chest like a dam giving way after years of holding back floodwaters. It was 1998, and the city still felt like a fever dream of neon and possibility before the corporate chains sanitized every corner, before the magic got buried under shareholders and safety regulations. Tommy was 11 then, all elbows and knees, and that gap-toothed smile that made his mother cry happy tears when she thought no one was looking. We weren't supposed to go to Vegas. Hell, we weren't supposed to be anywhere together as a family, if I'm being honest. Maria had been carrying the weight of single motherhood for 3 years when I stumbled into their lives, literally stumbled, tripping over Tommy's skateboard on the front steps of their duplex apartment while delivering what I thought was a pizza to the wrong address. But Maria opened that door in her waitress uniform, hair pulled back in a ponytail that had seen better days, and Tommy peeked around her legs like a curious bird, and something in my chest said, "Here, this is where you stop running." The Vegas trip was supposed to be my grand gesture, my way of proving to Maria that I could be more than just the guy who fixed their leaky faucet and remembered to pick up milk on the way home from work. I'd been saving for months, skimming $20 here and there from my construction wages, hiding bills in a coffee can under my workbench like some kind of domestic pirate. "We're going to do this right," I told her one evening as we sat on their tiny back porch, watching Tommy chase fireflies in the dying light. Real family vacation, the kind kids remember their whole lives. Maria laughed, but it wasn't the cruel kind of laugh. It was the exhausted kind, the kind that comes from years of learning not to hope too hard for things that might disappear. "Jack, you don't have to." "I want to," I said. And I meant it with every fiber of muscle and bone in my body. Tommy deserves to see something bigger than this town. Hell, we all do. So we drove west in my pickup truck with the questionable air conditioning and the radio that only picked up country stations and religious programming. Tommy sat between us on the bench seat, his skinny legs not quite reaching the floor, playing with that silver chain necklace his real father had given him before disappearing into whatever hole deadbeat dads crawl into when child support comes calling. The necklace had a small silver cross on it, nothing fancy, probably bought at some gas station, but Tommy wore it like it was made of solid gold and blessed by the Pope himself. "Mom, look," Tommy would say every few miles, pressing his face against the window as the landscape shifted from farmland to desert. "Look how far we can see. It's like the whole world is spread out like a blanket." Maria would turn in her seat and smile at him, really smile, the kind that started in her eyes and worked its way down to her mouth, and I would feel that dangerous flutter of hope in my stomach again, the feeling that maybe we could actually pull this off. Maybe we could actually become the family I'd been pretending we already were. The first sign that something was different about Las Vegas came when we were still 20 miles out. Tommy had fallen asleep against my shoulder, his breath warm and steady against my arm, and Maria was dozing with her head against the passenger window. The radio had been cycling through static for the past hour when suddenly it locked onto a clear signal. Some jazz station playing music that sounded like it was being broadcast from underwater. The melody was beautiful, but wrong somehow, like hearing a lullaby played backwards, and I reached over to change the station, but my hand stopped halfway to the dial. "Leave it," Maria said without opening her eyes. "It's nice." But it wasn't nice, not really. It was the kind of music that made you think about things you'd rather forget, about choices you'd made and roads you'd left untraveled. It was the kind of music that sounded like longing given form, and as we drove through the desert with that strange melody filling the truck cab, I had the uncomfortable feeling that we were driving towards something instead of away from it, something that had been waiting for us long before we'd ever decided to take this trip. Tommy woke up as the city came into view, and his gasp of wonder was exactly what I'd hoped for. Vegas in 1998 was still magic, still a city that believed in its own impossible promises. The Luxor Pyramid stretched into the desert sky like something built by aliens. The Stratosphere Tower reached towards stars that were washed out by the glow of 10 million light bulbs, and the Strip unrolled before us like a river of pure electricity. "Holy cow," Tommy whispered, pressing both hands against the window. "It's like Christmas and the 4th of July had a baby." Maria laughed, really laughed, and I felt that flutter of hope spread its wings a little wider in my chest. Maybe this would work. Maybe this would be the trip that cemented us together, that took 3 separate people and made them into something indivisible. We checked into the Flamingo, not because it was fancy, but because it was what I could afford, and because Tommy had developed an obsession with flamingos after a school project about birds. Our room was on the 14th floor, and the view stretched across the Strip to the mountains beyond, purple and jagged against the evening sky. Tommy spent the first hour just staring out the window, occasionally updating us on the number of cars passing below or the color changes in the fountain at the Bellagio. "Can we go swimming?" he asked as the sun set and the city began its nightly transformation into something altogether more spectacular. "After dinner," Maria said, already unpacking our meager collection of vacation clothes. "But first, your stepfather wants to show us something special." Stepfather. She'd never used that word before, and hearing it made my throat tight. Tommy looked at me with those dark eyes that were so much like his mother's, waiting for whatever surprise I had planned, and I realized I hadn't actually planned anything. I'd been so focused on getting us here that I hadn't thought about what we'd do once we arrived. "The penny slots," I said, improvising. "There's a whole section where kids can play while parents gamble nearby, perfectly legal and everything." It was a lie, of course. Kids couldn't be anywhere near the casino floor, but I needed to buy time, needed to figure out how to make this trip magical instead of just expensive. We ended up at the buffet instead, where Tommy loaded his plate with enough shrimp to feed a small fishing village, and Maria tried every dessert on the table while I watched them both with the kind of happiness that feels too big for your body to contain. Later, while Maria soaked in the hotel bathtub and Tommy played with the ice machine down the hall, I stood on our balcony and looked out at the city spreading below us like a circuit board made of light. The air smelled like desert and air conditioning, and the faint chemical tang of chlorine from the pool far below. I was 34 years old, and for the first time in my life, I had something to lose. The thought should have made me happy, but instead it filled me with a kind of low-grade terror that I couldn't quite name. Tommy's laughter echoed from the hallway, bright and clear, and I turned back toward the room just as Maria appeared in the bathroom doorway, wrapped in a hotel towel, her hair wet and dark against her shoulders. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for this, for all of it." "You don't need to thank me," I said, but she shook her head. "Yes, I do. Tommy's father never—" She trailed off, looking toward the door where we could hear Tommy talking to someone in the hallway, probably another kid staying on our floor. "He never wanted to be a family." "Not really, but you do, and that means everything." I was about to respond when Tommy burst through the door, eyes wide with excitement. "Jack, there's a kid down the hall whose dad works for the circus that's at Circus Circus, and he says they've got real lions and tigers and everything, and his dad can get us tickets for tomorrow night, but we have to decide right now because it's almost sold out, and his dad is leaving in 10 minutes to go back to work and—" "Slow down, buddy," I said, putting my hands on his shoulders. "What kind of circus?" But even as I asked the question, I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Tommy's excitement was infectious, the kind of pure joy that adults spend their whole lives trying to recapture. But there was something else there too, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "He says it's not like other circuses," Tommy continued, bouncing on his toes. "He says they do shows that make people disappear for real, not just magic tricks. He says sometimes people go in and they don't come out the same." Maria and I exchanged a look over Tommy's head. The kid was 11. He didn't understand the implications of what he was saying, didn't hear the warning bells that were going off in every adult instinct I possessed. "Maybe we should stick to the regular attractions," Maria said carefully. "The roller coaster at New York, maybe catch a show." "But Mom," Tommy whined, and his voice took on that particular pitch that parents learn to fear. "This is a once-in-a-lifetime thing. The kid says his dad might be able to get us backstage, show us how the magic works." I looked out the window at the city below, all those lights promising things that were probably too good to be true, and made a decision that I've regretted every single day for the past 27 years. "Let's go meet this kid's father," I said. The man was waiting by the elevators when we emerged from our room 10 minutes later. He was tall and thin, with the kind of pale skin that suggested he spent most of his time indoors. And when he smiled at us, I noticed that his teeth were too white and too perfect, like something made in a laboratory. He wore a black suit, despite the desert heat, and his hair was slicked back with something that made it shine under the fluorescent hallway lights. "You must be Tommy," he said, extending a hand that Tommy shook enthusiastically. "I'm Mr. Valdez. My son Carlos has told me so much about you." I looked around for Carlos, but the hallway was empty except for us. "He had to go back to the room," Mr. Valdez explained, somehow reading my thoughts. "Past his bedtime, you understand. But he was so excited about meeting Tommy that he begged me to extend the invitation personally." There was something wrong with the man's voice, though I couldn't put my finger on what it was. The words were right, the tone was friendly enough, but there was something underneath it, like hearing a song played at the wrong speed. "About these circus tickets," Maria said, and I could hear the maternal suspicion in her voice, the instinct that had kept her and Tommy safe through 3 years of single motherhood. "Ah, yes," Mr. Valdez said, reaching into his jacket pocket and producing 3 tickets printed on heavy cardstock. "Tomorrow night, 8 o'clock. VIP seating, backstage access after the show, my gift to a fellow traveler." The tickets looked legitimate enough, with holographic seals and detailed printing, but something about them made my skin crawl. Maybe it was the way the text seemed to shift slightly when I wasn't looking directly at it, or maybe it was the fact that the paper felt warm to the touch, like it had been sitting in direct sunlight. "That's very generous," I said slowly, "but we couldn't possibly—" "Please, Mr." Valdez interrupted, and for just a moment his perfect smile faltered, revealing something desperate underneath. "Carlos will be so disappointed if his new friend doesn't come. The circus it's very special, unlike anything you've ever seen." Tommy was practically vibrating with excitement, looking back and forth between the 3 adults, as if he could will us to agree through sheer force of enthusiasm. Maria bit her lip. A habit I'd learned meant she was weighing maternal instinct against the desire to make her son happy. "It's perfectly safe," Mr. Valdez added, and something in the way he said it made it sound like anything but. "We'll take them," I said, and the words left my mouth before I'd consciously decided to speak them. Maria looked at me in surprise, and Tommy let out a whoop of joy that echoed off the hallway walls. Mr. Valdez's smile returned, wider than before, and he handed me the tickets with fingers that felt cold even in the desert heat. "Wonderful," he said. "I think you'll find tomorrow night to be educational." He turned to leave, then paused and looked back at Tommy. "That's a beautiful necklace," he said, pointing to the silver chain at Tommy's throat. "A gift from someone special?" Tommy's hand went instinctively to the cross, protective and proud. "My dad gave it to me," he said. "My real dad." "Before he went away?" Mr. Valdez nodded slowly, like Tommy had just confirmed something he'd already known. "How precious," he said. "I hope you'll never lose it." The next day passed in a blur of typical Vegas family activities. We rode the roller coaster at New York, where Tommy screamed with delight and Maria gripped my hand so tightly I lost circulation in my fingers. We walked through the Forum shops at Caesars, where Tommy marveled at the talking statues and I marveled at the price tags. We spent the afternoon by the pool, where Tommy made friends with a girl from Wisconsin whose parents were celebrating their 20th wedding anniversary, and I tried not to think about the circus tickets tucked into my wallet like a ticking time bomb. But as evening approached, the dread I'd been pushing down all day began to surface. There was something wrong about the whole situation, something that my rational mind couldn't quite grasp, but my gut understood perfectly. The problem was that Tommy had been talking about the circus all day, counting down the hours like it was Christmas morning, and I couldn't bear the thought of disappointing him. "We don't have to go," Maria said quietly as we got dressed for dinner. Tommy was in the bathroom, singing some song I didn't recognize while he brushed his teeth. "We could tell him you're not feeling well. Take him to see the volcano at the Mirage instead." I wanted to say yes. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to say yes. But when I looked at her face, I saw that she wanted to go almost as much as Tommy did, wanted to be the kind of family that did adventurous things together, that created memories worth talking about for decades to come. "It's just a circus," I said, trying to convince myself as much as her. What's the worst that could happen? Famous last words, as it turned out. Circus at night was a different beast than it was during the day. The clown-themed decorations that seemed kitschy and harmless in the afternoon took on a sinister quality under the harsh fluorescent lights, and the circus acts on the main floor looked tired and desperate. Performers going through motions they'd repeated thousands of times for audiences that barely bothered to look up from their slot machines. But the show we were attending wasn't on the main floor. Mr. Valdez met us at a service entrance I never would have found on my own, dressed in the same black suit, but somehow looking even paler than he had the night before. He led us through a maze of service corridors that smelled like industrial carpet and cleaning chemicals, past rooms filled with broken slot machines and discarded costumes from shows that had closed years ago. "The real circus," he explained as we walked, "happens away from the tourists, away from the cameras and the regulations and the safety inspectors who wouldn't understand what they were seeing anyway." We descended a staircase that seemed to go down much farther than it should have, given that we were in a building in the middle of the desert. The air grew cooler as we walked, and I began to hear sounds from below us, music that was similar to what we'd heard on the radio during our drive into the city, but distorted, like it was being played through water or thick glass. "How far down does this go?" Maria asked, and I could hear the nervousness in her voice. "Deep enough," Mr. Valdez replied without turning around. "The desert has more layers than most people realize." Finally, we emerged into a circular theater that couldn't possibly have existed in the space we'd just descended into. The ceiling stretched up into darkness, supported by pillars that seemed to be carved from black stone, and the seating descended toward a central stage like an ancient amphitheater. The walls were covered in murals that hurt to look at directly, images that seemed to shift and writhe when caught in peripheral vision. There were maybe 30 other people scattered throughout the theater, all of them sitting alone or in small groups, all of them staring at the stage with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for hypnosis subjects. In the dim lighting, it was hard to make out details, but something about the other audience members made me uncomfortable. They sat too still, breathed too quietly, blinked too infrequently. "These are great seats," Tommy said, apparently oblivious to the wrongness that permeated everything around us. We were in the third row, close enough to see every detail of whatever was about to happen on stage. The lights dimmed further, and the music grew louder, resolving into something that might have been a waltz, if waltzes were designed to induce anxiety rather than romance. A spotlight appeared on the stage, illuminating a figure in a top hat and tails who seemed to have materialized from the darkness itself. "Ladies and gentlemen," the figure said, and his voice carried perfectly through the theater, despite the fact that I couldn't see any microphones or speakers. "Welcome to the disappearing act." What followed was unlike any circus performance I'd ever seen or imagined. The acts weren't just magic tricks. They were impossibilities made manifest. A woman stepped into a mirror and emerged from another mirror on the opposite side of the stage, but her reflection remained in the first mirror, waving goodbye to herself. A man juggled balls of light that turned into birds, that turned into butterflies, that turned into nothing at all. A child no older than Tommy walked across the stage on her hands, but her shadow remained upright, walking normally in the opposite direction. Tommy watched it all with wide eyes and an open mouth, occasionally reaching over to tug on my sleeve when something particularly amazing happened. Maria sat rigid in her seat, her hand gripping mine so tightly that her knuckles were white, and I found myself holding my breath during each act, afraid that exhaling might somehow break whatever spell was keeping the laws of physics suspended. But it was the final act that changed everything. The ringmaster returned to center stage, but now he wasn't alone. Behind him stood 3 figures in white robes, their faces hidden by hoods that cast shadows deeper than the lighting should have allowed. "For our finale," the ringmaster announced, "we need a volunteer from the audience. Someone young, someone brave, someone ready to see the world from an entirely new perspective." I felt Tommy straighten beside me, and my heart sank. Of course he would want to volunteer. Of course he would see this as the adventure of a lifetime rather than the trap it so obviously was. "Tommy, no," I whispered, but he was already standing up, his hand raised high in the air. "Pick me," he called out, his voice cutting through the strange music like a knife through silk. "I'm brave. I'm ready." The ringmaster's head turned toward us with mechanical precision, and when his eyes met Tommy's, I saw something pass between them, some kind of recognition or acknowledgement that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. "Ah," the ringmaster said, and his smile was wide enough to reveal too many teeth. "Perfect." The next few minutes unfolded like a nightmare played in slow motion. Tommy bounded down the aisle toward the stage, his silver necklace catching the spotlight as he moved. Maria started to stand, started to call him back, but something held her in place, some invisible force that seemed to press down on all of us, except Tommy. On stage, the robed figures arranged themselves in a triangle around a tall mirror that hadn't been there moments before. The mirror's surface rippled like water, reflecting not the theater, but something else entirely. A landscape of red rock and endless sky that looked almost like the desert we'd driven through to get here, but wrong somehow, like a photograph printed with the wrong color settings. "The disappearing act," the ringmaster explained to the audience, "is not about making something vanish. It's about sending it somewhere else, somewhere better, somewhere where the rules are different and the possibilities are infinite." Tommy stood at the edge of the stage, looking back at us with an expression of pure excitement, and I tried to stand, tried to call out to him, but my voice wouldn't work and my legs wouldn't move. The strange music had grown louder, more insistent, and the other audience members had begun to sway in their seats like wheat in a wind I couldn't feel. "All you have to do," the ringmaster said, placing a hand on Tommy's shoulder, "is step through the mirror, step through and see what's waiting on the other side." Tommy looked at the rippling surface of the mirror, then back at us one more time. He smiled, that gap-toothed grin that had first made me fall in love with the idea of being his father, and he waved. "See you on the other side," he called out, his voice bright with anticipation. And then he stepped forward, into the mirror, and disappeared. The surface of the mirror went still, reflecting only the theater and the empty space where Tommy had been standing a moment before. The robed figures bowed to the audience. The ringmaster tipped his hat, and the spotlight went out, plunging the theater into complete darkness. When the lights came back up, the stage was empty. The mirror was gone, the robed figures were gone, the ringmaster was gone. It was just a normal stage in an abnormal theater, and Tommy was nowhere to be seen. I found my voice then, found my legs, and I was on my feet and moving toward the stage before I'd consciously decided to do so. Maria was right behind me, calling Tommy's name, her voice echoing off the stone walls like a prayer that couldn't find its way to heaven. "Tommy!" I shouted, leaping onto the stage and looking around frantically for some sign of him, some indication of where he'd gone. "Tommy, this isn't funny! Come out!" But there was nothing. No hidden trapdoors, no secret panels, no mirrors or smoke machines or any of the usual circus equipment that might explain what we'd just witnessed. Just an empty stage and the growing realization that my stepson had vanished into thin air in front of 30 witnesses, and nobody seemed surprised, except for us. Mr. Valdez appeared at the edge of the stage, still wearing that too-perfect smile, and I grabbed him by the lapels of his black suit and slammed him against the nearest pillar. "Where is he?" I demanded, my voice raw with panic and rage. "Where's my son?" "Your son?" Mr. Valdez asked, tilting his head like a confused dog. "I'm sorry, but I don't know what you're talking about." Maria had climbed onto the stage and was checking behind curtains that hadn't been there during the show, calling Tommy's name in a voice that was becoming increasingly desperate. The other audience members were filing out of the theater in perfect silence, moving like sleepwalkers toward exits I couldn't remember seeing when we'd entered. "The kid who volunteered," I said, shaking Mr. Valdez hard enough to rattle his teeth. "The boy who stepped through the mirror. Where did they take him?" Mr. Valdez's smile never wavered, but something cold and alien flickered behind his eyes. "I think you must be mistaken," he said calmly. "No children volunteered tonight. The show ended exactly as it was supposed to. I wanted to hit him. I wanted to hit him so hard that his perfect teeth scattered across the stage like dice. But Maria's voice stopped me. "Jack," she said, and the tone of her voice made me release Mr. Valdez and turn toward her. She was standing center stage, holding something in her hands, and when I saw what it was, my knees almost gave out. Tommy's silver necklace, the cross his father had given him, the one he never took off, was lying on the stage floor where he'd been standing when he stepped through the mirror. The chain was broken, as if it had been torn away with considerable force. By the time I looked back, Mr. Valdez was gone. The theater was empty, except for Maria and me, and the echo of our own voices calling a name that no one else seemed to remember. We spent the next 6 hours in hell. First, we called hotel security, who treated us like parents who'd simply lost track of their child in a busy casino. Then, we called the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police, who took a report but seemed skeptical of our story about underground theaters and disappearing acts. When we tried to bring investigators back to the service entrance where we'd met Mr. Valdez, we couldn't find it. The corridors we'd walked through seemed to have been replaced by solid walls, and the staircase we'd descended simply didn't exist. "You're sure this is where you entered?" the detective asked, shining his flashlight on a wall that looked like it had been in place for decades. "I'm sure," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I began to doubt myself. The panic and adrenaline and sheer impossibility of the situation had created a kind of cognitive dissonance that made me question everything I thought I remembered. The security footage from the casino was no help. The cameras showed us entering Circus through the main entrance, but after that we seemed to vanish from the record. 3 hours of footage showing us nowhere, doing nothing, talking to no one. When we reappeared on camera, we were running through the main casino floor, clearly distressed, asking anyone who would listen if they'd seen a boy in a red shirt. "Maybe you should consider," the detective said gently, "that this whole underground circus thing was some kind of hallucination. Vegas can be overwhelming, especially for people who aren't used to the lights and the noise and the stimulation. Sometimes the mind creates elaborate explanations for things that have simpler causes." But Maria and I knew what we'd seen. We knew what we'd experienced. Tommy had stepped through a mirror and disappeared, and no amount of rational explanation could change that fact. We stayed in Vegas for another week, searching. We posted flyers with Tommy's picture all over the city. We contacted every circus and magic show and street performer we could find. We hired a private investigator who took our money and produced nothing but a report that concluded Tommy had probably run away and would turn up when he got hungry enough. But Tommy wouldn't have run away. Tommy loved us, loved the life we were building together. He was excited about starting 6th grade, excited about the Halloween costume he'd been planning since July, excited about Christmas and summer vacation and all the ordinary magic that makes up a childhood. Tommy wouldn't have run away, but Tommy was gone. We drove home in silence, Maria staring out the passenger window at the desert landscape that looked completely different in daylight, like a stage set that had been struck between acts. The radio couldn't find any clear stations, just static and fragments of songs that seemed to cut off mid-note, and I drove with the windows down, letting the hot wind fill the cab and blow away the artificial casino air that seemed to cling to our clothes and hair. Tommy's absence sat between us like a physical presence, heavier than his body had ever been. The bench seat seemed enormous without his skinny frame taking up the middle, and I found myself reaching for the radio to change stations that he would have complained about, looking in the rearview mirror to make eye contact that would never come. "We have to keep looking," Maria said when we were still an hour from home, her voice hoarse from crying and calling Tommy's name and explaining the unexplainable to police officers and hotel managers and anyone else who would listen. "I know," I said, though I had no idea how to keep looking for someone who had vanished into a mirror that didn't exist in a theater that couldn't be found. "Promise me," she said, turning to look at me for the first time since we'd left Vegas. "Promise me we won't stop looking." I promised, and I meant it, but promises are easy to make and hard to keep when you're searching for something that might not exist anymore, in places that might never have been real. The first few months were the worst. Maria quit her job at the diner so she could dedicate herself to the search full-time. She converted Tommy's bedroom into a command center, covering the walls with maps and timelines and photographs of every person we'd encountered in Vegas. She contacted missing children organizations and psychics and anyone who claimed to have expertise in unusual disappearances. I kept working construction, partly because we needed the money, but mostly because physical labor was the only thing that could quiet the noise in my head for a few hours at a time. But even hanging drywall or pouring concrete, I found myself looking for Tommy in every crowd, listening for his voice in every playground, jumping every time I saw a flash of red fabric or a boy with dark hair. The police investigation went nowhere. The FBI got involved briefly, but without any evidence of kidnapping or interstate transport, they had nothing to go on. The case file grew thicker but no more informative, filled with reports that all said the same thing. A child had disappeared without a trace, and no one could explain how or why or where he might have gone. Maria and I started growing apart without either of us acknowledging it. The grief and the guilt and the sheer impossibility of what had happened created a kind of pressure that pushed us away from each other, even as we tried to hold on. We'd sit across from each other at dinner, picking at food neither of us wanted to eat, surrounded by the sound of Tommy's absence. "Do you think," Maria said one evening about 6 months after Vegas, "that maybe we imagined it? The whole thing? Maybe the stress of trying to be a family, maybe the pressure of the trip, maybe we both just—" She didn't finish the sentence, but I knew what she was asking. Maybe we'd had some kind of shared psychotic break. Maybe Tommy had never existed at all. Maybe the photos on the refrigerator and the clothes in his closet and the toothbrush still sitting by the bathroom sink were elaborate delusions we'd constructed to avoid facing some other more mundane trauma. "He was real," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. After months of searching for someone who seemed to have been erased from existence, it was becoming easier to doubt everything than to believe in the impossible. Maria started dating someone from her grief counseling group about a year after Tommy disappeared. She didn't tell me about it directly, but I saw them together at the grocery store one afternoon, holding hands in the produce section, and something inside me that had been barely holding together finally snapped. I moved into a studio apartment across town and took a job with a different construction company. We didn't fight about it, didn't have a dramatic confrontation. We just let the distance between us grow until it was easier to be apart than together, until the love we'd built over 3 years became another casualty of that night in Vegas. I kept looking for Tommy, but the search became more of a ritual than a real investigation. I'd drive to different cities on weekends, walking through malls and amusement parks and anywhere else kids might gather, showing his photograph to anyone who would look at it. I contacted every missing children organization in the country, submitted his information to every database and website that existed. But as the years passed, Tommy's face in the photographs began to look younger than the kids I was searching for. He'd been 11 when he disappeared, but time kept moving forward without him. By 2005, he would have been 18, graduating from high school, maybe heading off to college. By 2010, he would have been 23, getting married, starting a career, becoming the kind of man I'd hoped to help him become. I tried to imagine what he might look like as he aged, tried to update my mental picture of him to match the passage of time, but he remained frozen in my memory as an 11-year-old boy with a gap-toothed smile and a silver cross around his neck, stepping through a mirror into somewhere else. In 2015, I got a call from a detective in Phoenix who thought he might have a lead. A young man matching Tommy's description had been found living on the streets, suffering from amnesia, unable to remember anything about his past. I drove to Arizona that same day, my heart pounding with hope for the first time in years. But it wasn't Tommy. The young man was the right age, had similar features, but his eyes were different, his voice was different. And when I showed him the photographs from our Vegas trip, there was no recognition, no spark of memory. He was just another lost person in a world full of them, and I drove home feeling emptier than I had when the search began. Maria remarried in 2018. I heard about it through mutual friends, heard that she was happy, that her new husband was a good man who understood her history and didn't try to replace what she'd lost. I was glad for her, genuinely glad, though hearing the news felt like closing a door I hadn't realized was still open. I stopped actively searching sometime around 2020. The pandemic made it impossible to travel, impossible to show photographs to strangers, impossible to maintain the kind of systematic investigation I'd been conducting for more than 2 decades. But more than that, I was tired. Tired of hoping. Tired of looking for someone who might not exist anymore. Tired of carrying the weight of a promise I couldn't keep. That's when I started having the dreams. They always started the same way. I'm back in that underground theater watching Tommy step through the mirror, but this time I can follow him. This time I can see where he goes. On the other side of the mirror is a place that looks like Las Vegas but isn't. A city made of light and shadow, where the buildings shift and change when you're not looking directly at them. Tommy is there, but he's not alone. There are other children, dozens of them, all wearing the same clothes they'd been wearing when they disappeared, all the same age they'd been when they stepped through mirrors or walked into forests or vanished from their bedrooms in the middle of the night. In the dreams, Tommy sees me and waves, that same gap-toothed smile lighting up his face. He tries to talk to me, tries to tell me something important, but his voice comes out like the music from that jazz station, distorted and underwater and impossible to understand. I try to step through the mirror to reach him, but something holds me back, some force that keeps me on this side of whatever boundary he's crossed. I always wake up from these dreams with the taste of dust in my mouth and the smell of casino air conditioning in my nostrils. And for the first few moments after waking, I can almost convince myself that Tommy is in the next room, getting ready for school, arguing with his mother about breakfast. But Tommy isn't in the next room. Tommy hasn't been anywhere I can reach for 27 years. Yesterday, everything changed. I was at work, replacing the HVAC system in a downtown office building, when my phone rang. The number was local but unfamiliar, and I almost didn't answer it. 27 years of false leads and mistaken identities had taught me to be cautious about unexpected phone calls. "Is this Jack Morrison?" the voice asked. Female, middle-aged, with a slight accent I couldn't place. "Yes," I said, setting down my wrench and stepping away from the noise of the worksite. My name is Carmen Vasquez. I work as a custodial supervisor at the Desert Diamond Casino. I think I have something that belongs to you. The Desert Diamond Casino. I'd never heard of it, but that didn't mean anything. New casinos opened and closed in Vegas all the time, smaller operations that couldn't compete with the mega resorts on the Strip. I'm sorry, I said, but I think you have the wrong number. I don't gamble, and I haven't been to Vegas in years. It's about your son, Carmen said, and something in her voice made my knees go weak. Your stepson, Tommy, the boy who disappeared at Circus Circus in 1998. The phone almost slipped from my hands. In 27 years, I'd gotten countless calls from people who thought they'd seen Tommy, thought they'd found him, thought they had information about what had happened that night. But none of them had ever known the specific details, the where and when and how of his disappearance. How do you know about that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Because I found his necklace, Carmen said, the silver chain with the cross. It was stuck in an air duct in our basement, behind some old equipment that hasn't been moved in decades. There's an inscription on the back of the cross, "To Tommy, love Dad." I did some research, found the missing person report from 1998, traced it back to you. I sat down hard on a stack of drywall, my head spinning. Tommy's necklace. The one that had been torn from his neck when he stepped through the mirror. The one Maria and I had found on the stage of that impossible theater. That's not possible, I said. We found that necklace the night he disappeared. It was broken, lying on the stage where he'd been standing. Mr. Morrison, Carmen said gently, I'm holding it in my hands right now. The chain is intact, no breaks or damage. It looks like it was placed in that air duct recently, maybe within the last few weeks. I tried to process what she was telling me, tried to make sense of how Tommy's necklace could be in two places at once, separated by 27 years, and however many miles lay between Circus Circus and the Desert Diamond Casino. Can you come to Vegas? Carmen asked. Can you come and see for yourself? I think there's more to this story than just a lost necklace. I was on the road within 2 hours, driving west through the same desert landscape I'd crossed with Maria and Tommy in 1998, but this time alone, with nothing but questions and a hope I was afraid to acknowledge. The radio played classic rock and country music, normal stations broadcasting normal programming, no underwater jazz or backwards lullabies. Vegas had changed in the years since I'd last visited. The city had grown larger, more corporate, less magical. The Flamingo was still there, but it looked smaller somehow, dwarfed by newer hotels that stretched higher into the desert sky. Circus Circus was still operating, but it had the tired, desperate air of a casino, trying to recapture a glory that had moved on to newer, shinier places. The Desert Diamond Casino was in an older part of the city, away from the Strip, housed in a building that looked like it had been constructed in the 1960s and hadn't been updated since. The parking lot was half empty, and the neon signs had the flickering, uncertain quality of electrical systems held together by hope and electrical tape. Carmen met me at the employee entrance, a woman in her 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes that had seen enough of the world to believe in impossible things. She led me through the same kind of service corridors I remembered from that night 27 years ago, past the same kinds of rooms filled with broken equipment and discarded dreams. I've been working here for 15 years, she said as we walked. I know every inch of this building, every pipe and duct and hidden space, but this morning, when I was checking the HVAC system in the basement, I found a section I'd never seen before. A room that doesn't appear on any of the building schematics. We descended a staircase that felt familiar in all the wrong ways, and I had to stop halfway down to catch my breath. The air was cooler here, and I could hear music in the distance, faint but unmistakable. That same underwater jazz that had played on our radio during the drive into Vegas all those years ago. Do you hear that? I asked. Carmen nodded. It started about a week ago. None of the other employees seem to notice it, but I hear it every time I come down here. The basement level was a maze of utility rooms and storage spaces, but Carmen led me with confidence toward a section that looked newer than the rest, despite being covered in dust and cobwebs that suggested decades of abandonment. We stopped in front of a door that shouldn't have existed, painted black with no markings or identifying numbers. "The room is behind this door," Carmen said, producing a key from her pocket. "I found the key in the same air duct as the necklace." She unlocked the door and pushed it open, revealing a small circular space that was immediately familiar. It was a miniature version of the theater where Tommy had disappeared, complete with the same black stone pillars and the same murals that hurt to look at directly. In the center of the room stood a tall mirror, its surface rippling like water, reflecting not the room we were standing in, but something else entirely. And hanging from a hook beside the mirror, as if someone had just placed it there, was Tommy's silver necklace. I approached it slowly, afraid that moving too quickly might cause it to disappear, like everything else connected to that night. But it was real, solid, warm to the touch. The chain was intact, just as Carmen had said, and when I turned the cross over, I could see the inscription Tommy's father had made. "To Tommy, love, Dad." "There's something else," Carmen said, pointing to the mirror. "Look at the reflection." I looked, and what I saw there made my heart stop. The mirror showed the same impossible landscape I'd seen in my dreams, a city made of light and shadow, where the buildings shifted and changed, where the sky was the wrong color, and the laws of physics seemed to be more suggestions than rules. And standing in the center of that landscape, looking directly at me through the mirror, was Tommy. He was exactly as I remembered him. 11 years old, gap-toothed smile, dark hair that never stayed where his mother had combed it. He was wearing the same red shirt he'd been wearing the night he disappeared, and around his neck was an identical silver chain and cross. He saw me looking and waved, just like in my dreams, but this time when he spoke, I could hear him clearly. "Jack," he said, his voice carrying across whatever impossible distance separated us. "I've been waiting for you." I reached toward the mirror, my fingers touching the rippling surface, and for a moment I felt the boundary between worlds give way slightly, like touching the surface of water that was somehow vertical instead of horizontal. "Tommy," I said, my voice cracking with 27 years of grief and hope and love. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I let you go. I should have stopped you, should have kept you safe." Tommy shook his head, that patient expression he'd always worn when adults worried about things he'd already figured out. "It's not your fault," he said. "I chose to step through. I wanted to see what was on the other side." "Can you come back?" I asked. "Can you step back through?" Tommy looked around at the landscape behind him, considering the question seriously. "I don't know," he said finally. "This place, it's not bad, it's just different. Time works differently here. I'm still 11, but I remember everything that's happened since I left. I know about Mom getting remarried, about you never stopping looking for me, about all the dreams you've had." The idea that he'd been watching, somehow aware of what was happening in the world he'd left behind, was both comforting and heartbreaking. "Your mother," I said. "She needs to know you're okay. She needs to know what happened." "She knows," Tommy said, smiling that gap-toothed smile that had first made me want to be his father. "Not consciously, but she knows. The dreams reach her too, just differently." I looked down at the necklace in my hands, then back at the mirror, where Tommy wore an identical chain. "How is this possible?" I asked. "The necklace, this room, seeing you. The boundaries aren't as solid as people think," Tommy said, "especially in places like Vegas, where reality is already a little flexible. Sometimes things slip through, sometimes messages get passed along, sometimes people find their way to places that don't officially exist." Behind Tommy, I could see other figures moving in the strange landscape. Children and adults, people of all ages who had stepped through mirrors or walked into forests or vanished from locked rooms. They seemed content, not trapped or frightened, just existing in a place where the rules were different. "Are you happy?" I asked, the most important question of all. Tommy considered this for a moment, looking around at his impossible world before meeting my eyes again. "I'm not unhappy," he said. "I miss you and Mom, miss the life I would have had. But I've seen things here, learned things that I never could have experienced in your world. It's not better or worse, just different. I wanted to stay there forever, talking to him, making up for 27 years of missed conversations. But I could feel the mirror's surface beginning to solidify under my touch, could sense that whatever window had opened between our worlds was starting to close. "Will I see you again?" I asked. "Maybe," Tommy said. "But Jack, you have to stop looking for me in your world. I'm not there anymore, and searching for someone who isn't lost just keeps you lost. Find your life again. Find your happiness. I'm okay, and I need you to be okay too." And the mirror's surface went still, reflecting only the small circular room and my own tear-streaked face. Tommy was gone, but not in the way he'd been gone for the past 27 years. This time, I knew where he was, knew that he was safe, knew that somewhere in a place where the rules were different, an 11-year-old boy was continuing his interrupted adventure. I hung the necklace back on its hook beside the mirror, understanding somehow that it belonged there, that it was a bridge between worlds, rather than a lost possession. Carmen and I left the room together, and she locked the door behind us, but I knew I would be back. Not to search, not to try to bring Tommy home, but to visit, to maintain the connection between a father and son separated by more than distance. The drive home was different this time. The radio played clear, normal music, and the desert looked like just a desert instead of a barrier between one life and another. I called Maria from a rest stop in Arizona, and when she answered, I could hear in her voice that she already knew why I was calling. "You found him," she said, not a question, but a statement. "I found him," I confirmed. "He's okay, Maria. He's happy, and he wants us to be happy too." We talked for an hour, sharing details about dreams we'd both been having but had never discussed, comparing notes on a grief that had been transformed into something else, something that felt more like gratitude than loss. We wouldn't get back together. Too much time had passed, too much life had been lived separately, but the thing that had driven us apart, the mystery of Tommy's disappearance, had been resolved, and in its place was something peaceful. I still live in that studio apartment across town. I still work construction, still drive through the desert on weekends, but now I'm traveling toward things instead of searching for them. I visit that room in the Desert Diamond Casino once a month, and sometimes the mirror shows me glimpses of Tommy's world, updates on his impossible life in a place where 11-year-old boys can stay 11 forever if they choose to. Carmen has become a friend, a keeper of impossible secrets, who understands that some stories don't have endings, just transformations. We drink coffee in the casino's employee break room and talk about the things we've seen that other people wouldn't believe, about the spaces between reality where lost things sometimes choose to stay lost. It's been 6 months since I found Tommy's necklace, since I looked through the mirror and saw him waving from the other side of forever. The dreams have changed. They're warmer now, less urgent, more like visits than searching. Sometimes other figures appear in them. Maria, looking younger than she has in years. My own father, who died when I was Tommy's age. People I've loved and lost, who seem to have found their way to that place where the rules are different. I've started dating someone, a woman named Sarah, who works at the library and believes in impossible things without needing proof. I told her about Tommy, about the mirror, about the 27 years I spent searching for someone who wasn't lost. She listened without judgment, without suggesting that grief had made me delusional, and when I finished the story, she simply said, "I'm glad you found each other again." Maybe that's the real magic. Not the mirrors or the underground theaters or the places where reality bends like light through water, but the simple act of being understood, of having someone believe in the impossible things that shape our lives. Tommy's necklace still hangs beside the mirror in that locked room beneath the Desert Diamond Casino. Sometimes when I visit, the cross catches the light from the rippling surface and throws rainbows across the black stone walls. And I remember the summer when an 11-year-old boy called me Dad for the first time and made me believe in the possibility of family. He's still 11, still gap-toothed, still wearing that red shirt and that silver chain. But now when he waves from the other side of the mirror, I wave back without trying to follow him, understanding finally that love doesn't require presence, that some connections transcend the boundaries between worlds. I'm okay, Tommy, just like you wanted me to be.